More simply, more simply put, if you enjoy weekends and a free childhood, you can thank labor unions and labor organizing for them. But to speak more personally and particularly, I can say that my job, which is, as I mentioned, just finished a class in the city colleges of Chicago where I teach. I am happy that and lucky to have been online since the pandemic, and that job is protected by a labor union. Both before and since the pandemic, being part of a labor union has ensured that I, as a part-time ESL and GED teacher in a community college, am free to teach without fear of reprisal for content I might include in my courses, such as readings on race and racism. And I do not fear losing my position because of a change in enrollment. I know that the material and students we teach are not subject to the caprice of administrators who might choose to exclude either. And I know that my income is not subject to arbitrary reductions because managers and high-level officials in the community college system decide that they cannot continue to pay us because they prioritize their full-time salaries over our part-time hourly wages. And so these are just a few of the things for which I am thankful that I have a union and hope never to work without one. Our speakers today can tell us more about why they believe in, work for, and are thankful to be connected to unions, as well as what they do to make sure that the labor force gets further organized and stronger in the ever-present battle between capital and labor in our global society. And so I'm going to start by introducing Kevin Prosen. We have the pleasure this evening of having as one of our guests Kevin Prosen, who is a delegate in the United Federation of Teachers and a founder of the movement of rank and file educators, the social justice caucus of the UFT. He is on the steering committee of the United Caucus of Rank and File Educators, a national network of rank and file union organizers. He hosts organizer trainings through the nonprofit Labor Notes. And please, Kevin, take it away.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm just going to start by saying, I am speaking here just in my capacity as a public school teacher, as a union member, and as someone who does organizing with the rank and file of the union, which means the workers who the union represents. So I'm not speaking here as on behalf of the UFT per se. I'm just trying to give the perspective of someone who's in a highly organized field, which has been kind of at the center of a lot of the labor disputes over the last decade or more. So I guess what I'll say is just a little bit about what is happening with teachers unions, and then I'll try to speak to some of the maybe bigger political themes that would be of interest to Democrats abroad. So as people know, teachers unions have been, I guess, in the vanguard of a new labor movement that has been emerging over the last, let's say, roughly 10 years. Labor unions obviously were in steep decline from, let's say, roughly the early 80s onward. And I'm sure our other panelists can speak to some of that history. But we've seen a turnaround that's been slowly gathering steam. And in my estimation, it sort of starts around the time of the Chicago teachers' strike in 2010, which was a turning point where teachers were able to essentially take over the leadership of their union and reorient it to make the union more democratic and more accountable to its membership. They created, through that strike, a model that is now being replicated around the country, where we are seeing a new leadership emerge in the teachers unions and a new spirit of, I guess I'll say, class struggle, which is evidenced in many of the strikes that have taken place in Chicago, Los Angeles, and other big cities, but also, and very importantly, in places across the South where union rights are much more curtailed and where unions have traditionally been weaker, especially teachers unions. So, for example, the statewide strike in West Virginia a few years ago, which I'm sure many people heard of, was a clear indicator that there was a new spirit, certainly among teachers. why are teachers in this position? Why have they been in the leadership of this new labor movement? I think it's because we are sort of the last one standing. And therefore, in the attempt to privatize what's left of the public sector, we are kind of the last bastion for the working class to defend these institutions. And obviously, very well-funded organizations and people on the right have a very concentrated agenda of essentially privatizing American public education, either slowly through charterization or rapidly through kind of trying to transfer money directly to religious schools. People, I'm sure, have followed the disputes in the US over COVID and school closures. While this was a very complicated terrain for teachers' unions to navigate, it was one where we came under quite a bit of fire from Republicans who are now targeting schools with a raft of really, not only attacking unions, but with a raft of really regressive social legislation to try to basically drum LGBT teachers out of the profession in some states, attacks on our autonomy to decide curriculum and so on. And so this is where you hear all these fights about critical race theory and these other kind of right-wing shibboleths. So American teachers, I'm trying to go very quickly over this history, but I would love to talk about it in conversation with you all more. American teachers have been, I guess their organizing has been on the upswing now for over a decade. And their organizing has spread from sort of deep blue cities to deep red states. And this is extremely significant, but I think what's happening now is we're seeing, and it's not only in the public sector teachers where we're seeing this, we're also seeing it in other aspects of like the care work economy, like nursing. And you could tell a story about the attacks on hospitals and healthcare that is very similar to the one you could tell about the attacks on public schools. And so nurses have also found themselves in a sort of new organizing mode. But what's happening now, and I heard you mention it in the introduction a little bit, is all of this new organizing energy is now starting to cross over into the private sector. And we're hearing it with Starbucks, and we're seeing it at Amazon, a sort of new militancy in the labor movement that is extremely promising. Some of that is due to the organizing. I would say most of that is due to the organizing of workers in these industries. A lot of this organizing is happening independently of the large traditional kind of bureaucratic unions, or sort of outside their main umbrellas. And that is itself really significant. It indicates that there's truly new organizing going on that's led by workers. The other thing that's happening is that we have a very friendly National Labor Relations Board for the first time in a long time. And so the Biden administration has sort of signaled to workers at places like Starbucks that there's going to be more room for organizing maybe than there's been in a very long time. So I guess speaking to Democrats abroad, what I would say is that that's extremely significant. And I think fighting for a pro-worker NLRB is important, but there's a number of other things that Democrats can do to encourage this organizing. And I want to make a point about why I think it's important that Democrats encourage and make space for organizing in the labor movement. And that's that the crisis of democracy that we're facing in the United States is a direct result of the crisis of inequality in the country. And so if we want to resolve the problems of democracy we have in this country, it's going to require a stronger labor movement that is able to organize autonomously on its own, but that can get support from Democrats. Because the fact is we're up against a deeply anti-democratic right wing in this country. And the institutions of the state itself are biased against labor in all sorts of ways. And so trying to shift the balance of power in those institutions to make new organizing possible is the role Democrats can play to help the labor movement, in my opinion. So things like the PRO Act, which would enable more new organizing, I think should be really high priorities. It would benefit the labor unions, but it would also give Democrats more of an independent power base to lean on. The other thing I would say, though, is that stronger labor unions are going to be healthy for the Democratic Party in another way, and that it's going to increase the kind of constituency for progressive politics in the party, right? Because we know the Democrats have a base of support in workers, but I'm sorry to say, they also have a base of support among very wealthy people. And so shifting the balance of power inside the party towards labor, I think, is really important. And so I understand I'm speaking to the progressive caucus of the Democrats abroad. And I think when we're thinking about the politics of the Democratic Party going forward, the Biden administration has been, in many ways, a bit of a step in the right direction. But I think when we're talking about deepening the democracy in the party, strong independent labor unions are just going to be crucial to that. And that we need to rebuild unions as an engine of economic democracy in the country, because if we don't, the political democracy, as we've seen, is going to fade along with it. And so I think it's just really important that Democrats prioritize seeing labor as not just one other progressive constituency, but as like a way to force change. I mean, the labor movement is disruptive potentially in a way other movements are, but it's that capacity to disrupt the economy and to disrupt the flow of money when it has to happen that gives it its power. And so it's important that we increase unions' ability to use that power when necessary. And it's important that we respect the independence and autonomy of the labor movement, but also that we create space for unions to continue to grow. That's going to have good effects on American democracy, and it's going to have a good effect on the Democratic Party. And that is all, not to mention what's self-evident, which is it's going to make the lives of workers significantly better. Workers in America live in extremely precarious conditions compared to their brothers and sisters in many other wealthy countries. And so, rebuilding a welfare state around strong unions and a strong economy for workers, I just think is the direction Democrats need to move in.
All right, thank you, Kevin. I will also thank you for having brought to my attention some couple of months ago when you mentioned to me the idea that inflation gets a bad rap because it actually generally is a sign that workers have been doing better, and that's why corporate and wealthy, or the ruling class, let's call it, tends to up prices because they realize how well workers have been doing in a less than direct way, perhaps. But I want to say as well, we have our second speaker this evening, and that's Roberto Clacke, who is the Executive Director at Temp Worker Justice, a national organization dedicated to fighting for the labor rights of millions of temporary staffing agency workers laboring in major industries across the US. During his 2 decades of organizing, he has spent time working in the housing, peace, and labor movements. As part of his work in the peace movement, Roberto helped organize Iraq Veterans Against Wars, the Winter Soldier event in 2008, and Iraq Veterans Against the Wars NATO ceremony in 2012. As part of his work with workers' centers, he has been part of winning major legislation in Illinois, including the Fair Work Week campaign, the Chicago Sick Time Ordinance, the Illinois Clean Jobs Act, and helped stop new temporary staffing agency offices from gaining special use permits in his hometown in Joliet. Roberto started the first worker-centered based labor and environment department in the country and was a founding executive board member of the Illinois Green New Deal Coalition, along with serving as an elected board member of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. Roberto has helped raise millions of dollars for grassroots organizations in his 2 decades of organizing, and his communications work has been featured in publications including Vice News, The Nation, The New Republic, USA Today, In These Times, The Progressive, The Chicago Tribune, and WBEZ Radio. Do you want to go ahead and take it away, Roberto? Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me today. Once again, I'm the Executive Director of Temp Worker Justice, a national organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of the 16 million temporary staffing agency workers across the United States. This is an exciting time to talk about the labor movement, as we are in what could be a historic moment. For the first time ever, workers are organizing major corporations like REI, Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, and more. This is coupled with labor shortages that are giving workers unprecedented leverage in the workforce. Workers across the country are tired of low wages, precarious working conditions, and bad jobs. And in record numbers, they're saying, I quit. It's time to reframe the labor shortages for what it really is. It is a strike. We are seeing workers from across the country seize on this opportunity as they organize for new unions. I grew up and formerly worked as an organizer in the largest warehouse hub in the Midwest outside of Joliet, Illinois. And this is where I did my organizing at the beginning of the pandemic. Joliet is home to the largest inland port in the country, where 3.5% of the nation's GDP is moved in and out of warehouses for a who's who of Fortune 500 companies: Amazon, Walmart, Home Depot, IKEA. They work for Jeff Bezos, the Waltons, the Mars family. I think it's important to reflect on what led many workers to have such pro-union sentiments. During the pandemic, far too many of these essential workers paid with their health, or worse, their lives, as they move goods we all needed to survive. A report we published during the height of the pandemic, the COVID jungle, found that 11% of workers we surveyed knew someone who died from COVID, that 49% of the warehouse workers had no health insurance at all, and 61% had no paid sick days. I remind you that this workforce that is overwhelmingly people of color work for some of the most profitable and powerful corporations in the entire world. Many of these workers are tired and they are burnt out and they want change, and they want this change badly. We need to support them. How are we winning? I would argue part of the recent success of unions is workers more and more are identifying with progressive movements. In Bessemer, Alabama, is workers seeing their fight with Amazon as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Alphabet Worker Union members seeing gender affirming and access to reproductive health care rights be provided by Google to all workers, regardless of whether they're temp or contract or direct hire. It's workers identifying as democratic socialists, our workers identifying as environmentalists, embracing the Green New Deal. The emergence of progressive movements can help our labor movements and vice versa. Lastly, we need labor movements that embrace environmentalism and immigrant justice. Climate change threatens to create millions of climate refugees in the years to come. Employers understand this and are willing to exchange bad work visas for bad jobs to fleeing communities as a way to deal with the labor shortages and to undermine our leverage, our unprecedented leverage as workers. There should not be climate refugees to begin with. And it's the global north that's disproportionately responsible for the climate crisis. We need a labor movement that supports mitigating climate change by fighting for a Green New Deal and for pro-climate legislation. We also need a movement that ensures we have progressive immigration, visa, and work permit policies so that all workers are empowered to speak up and organize in the workplace. When we are divided by these distinctions, whether you're an immigrant, or Black, or brown, when we're divided by the bosses, it's the bosses who win. When we're able to come together, we can win living wages for our families, and we can get the benefits we need to strive, and we can have the dignity we all deserve in the workplace as workers. I believe our labor movement can win more by ensuring progressive policies for immigration, women, and climate change succeed. Thank you so much, Solidarity Forever, and thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Roberto. I want to now move our attention to our last speaker this morning, afternoon, and or evening, depending on where you are. And that is Harold Meyerson, who has since 2001 been an editor at the American Prospect, Washington-based liberal magazine, oscillating between the positions of editor at large, his current post, and executive editor. From 2003 to 2015, he was a weekly Washington Post op-ed columnist and is currently an op-ed contributor to the Los Angeles Times. An Atlantic Monthly survey has hailed him as one of the nation's 50 most influential columnists. From 1989 through 2001, he was executive editor and chief political writer at the LA Weekly, the nation's largest metropolitan weekly. His articles on politics, labor, the economy, foreign policy, and American culture have also appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Nation, and The New Statesman.
Daniel, you don't have to read the whole thing. Enough.
Well, I won't protest your protest. So if you would like to simply take it away, do feel free to do so. And Harold Meyerson, without further ado.
Thank you, Daniel, and it's good to see you. I met Daniel when he and my daughter came down from New York to DC so they could attend the Women's March the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump. And my house was fine after they left it. There was no damage inflicted. I also want to give a shout out to two Parisians on this call, Jerry Zellhofer and Penny Shantz, whom I've known for a very long time. Penny, it's got to be, I met Penny when she was the youth section organizer for DSOC, which was one of the two predecessor organizations for DSA. That was in the late 1970s when we still, didn't really have, railroads were just coming in, as I recall. So, but Penny has also been the chief European organizer for Bernie Sanders in Democrats Abroad, and I think I may have last seen her when she was with Bernie's brother Larry at the 2020 Democratic Convention. So hello to them, and hello to all of you. There is really a sea change in the way Americans feel about unions, and Gallup polls pretty much every year around Labor Day to get the approval rating of unions, and it is at a more than 50-year high. It was 68% last Labor Day, and among millennials, which I really want to stress, it was 77%. That's pretty much unheard of. And I think what we're seeing in the uprisings of young workers in retail, in the service sector, and on universities and teachers, I think I'm covering many of the constituencies you've already heard about here. What we're seeing is a bit of almost a generational issue, that the 2008 financial crash was followed by a very halting, very frustrating recovery, which millennials at that point bore the brunt of, and which Gen Zers are now coping with today. And it's those people who are doing a lot of the self-organizing that we've heard about already. Certainly the Starbucks campaign and the Amazon campaign are spearheaded by progressive young people and peopled, as it were, by progressive young people. This raises an interesting question as to what the union establishment's relationship with this is. The Starbucks campaign is backed in a sort of modest way by SEIU. The American Federation of Teachers, which we've heard from, is provided, I think, more assistance to the Amazon worker campaign than just about any other union. That's sort of on providing offices, facilities, and financing. Stephen Greenhouse, who was for years the New York Times labor beat reporter, retired, and now writing freelance, he and I co-authored a piece that said labor is kind of at its John L. Lewis moment, by which we meant that a whole sector of workers that hadn't been unionized is appearing now seeking unionization. And from our point of view, from Stephen and my point of view, it would be helpful if the established unions did what John L. Lewis's mine workers and Sidney Hillman's clothing workers did, which is, pour tremendous funding into those efforts, even if the new unions arose that were not members of their own unions. The United Auto Workers was eventually emerged, headed by certainly a younger generation of workers, so to the steel workers, so to the electrical workers, all unions that had been funded primarily by the mine workers, which are one of the very few large unions in the mid-1930s when all of this started to happen. And it would be very helpful if unions did that today. There are a lot of unions that are not interested in that, even as union membership has been faltering for half a century almost. They have their own sort of stable, small, relatively small domains, and aren't particularly interested in pushing it forward. So, there are changes and there are splits within the labor movement as to what to do about this. If we can consider helping working class, even if they're not becoming your members, a selfless task, which it isn't entirely, but it certainly puts you on the side of the angels. SEIU's campaign for a $15 minimum wage and a union, and it hasn't really after a decade netted SEIU any new members, but it sure the hell is responsible for the minimum wage being raised to $15 in places like California, New York, and elsewhere. There is, as we've heard, a job market which has been helping foster this current union uprising. Workers in many places have been confident that even if they lost their jobs, which certainly happens as employers fire unionizing workers, they could get at least a comparable job elsewhere. I'm not so sure that's the case in a place like Bessemer, Alabama, where Amazon actually is paying more than most of the other local places, but it is certainly true in Staten Island, where Amazon workers were able to form a union. So that is a factor. And if the Federal Reserve really slams the brakes on the economy, that could be problematic for the future of unionization, because there's a level of worker confidence right now, which only comes when there is something close to semi-demi full employment, which is sort of the state we're in now. The influx of young workers is really quite remarkable now. There are right now more university graduate student members of the United Auto Workers than there are employees of Chrysler. To a certain degree, public universities in states where public employee collective bargaining has been legalized, has been low-hanging fruit for any number of unions, including unions that really didn't have much of a history in organizing university employees, the UAW being one such example. Right now, though, by my estimates, a full 100,000 members of the 400,000 members United Auto Workers are university employees. So that's kind of an extreme example of seeing some of the changes we are now seeing in American labor. I want to talk a bit about, since it's come up, the Biden administration. One of the more interesting aspects of the Biden administration is that it has appointed a number of people out of the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. No one, I think, more impactful than the new general counsel of the NLRB, an NLRB lifetime staffer named Jennifer Abruzzo. And when we hear about the changes at the NLRB, Jennifer Abruzzo was sort of leading the charge, even though she's not one of the 5 commissioners. It's the general counsel who brings the cases to the board and who instructs all the NLRB attorneys around the country, of whom there are hundreds, as to how they should proceed on cases and what cases they should bring. Case in point, in trying to fight off the unionization of Starbucks, its founder and current acting CEO, Howard Schultz, has announced that he will give raises to everyone except people in the 200 plus Starbucks outlets that have gone union and those that have petitioned to go union, in addition to those 200 plus. A NLRB region recently filed suit saying this was forbidden by the National Labor Relations Act. Jennifer Abruzzo actually resurrected a 1947 long forgotten ruling of the NLRB, which basically says if an employer refuses to negotiate with a unit where a majority of workers have presented affiliation cards, that they can be ordered to go directly into collective bargaining, which is something that has not been a practice at the National Labor Relations Board or a feature of labor law for almost as long, for about as long as I've known Penny Shantz, actually. So there's a real change. There's a real change there. I'm glad we talked about the warehouse workers around Chicago. The only larger that I know of concentration of warehouses in the United States is in what California rather grandiosely calls the Inland Empire, which is parts of San Bernardino and Riverside counties to the east of Los Angeles. What makes that a particularly large cluster of warehouses is that most of the imports from Asia, which come into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which constitute 40% of all the imports into the United States, are then trucked to this massive concentration of warehouses in the Inland Empire to be resorted and sent out to Walmarts and Targets and for Amazon delivery. Last I heard, there are 35 Amazon warehouses in this rather constricted area, and that the number of employees in those warehouses is about 200,000. Now, I did a big feature for my magazine on this concentration in 2009, when the incoming Obama administration, there was hope for labor law reform, and the Teamsters and SEIU were seeking to organize those workers. And here we dealt with the issue of temp workers and what David Weil, an academic at Brandeis, has termed the fissured workplace. One of the characteristics of a fissured workplace is you're not actually working for your real life employer. At the time, for Walmart had contracted with logistics companies to run these warehouses, and Walmart did not own the warehouses. They rented them from some property dealers in the area. And the logistics company didn't hire the workers. There were 270 temp agencies in the area, and workers were nominally working for them, even though when I interviewed them, some of the workers said, oh, I've been here for 6 years. It's just, doing the same job. But the number of temp agencies who are my nominal employers has shifted about 12 times. That was, to put it mildly, a deterrent to unionization. Now, Amazon has a different model. Amazon actually employs the people in its warehouses, most of them anyway. Amazon's anti-labor policy is the work is so backbreaking that the average Amazon worker lasts about 8 months, which is a huge deterrent, if you think about it, to unionization, and makes the achievement in Staten Island all the more remarkable. The annual turnover rate of Amazon employees is in excess of 100%. Nonetheless, the Teamsters, I think, are looking at this cluster, the Teamsters being the largest union that has expressed, done some stuff on looking at unionizing the Amazon warehouses. Obviously, their task would be made easier if the latest iteration of labor law reform were enacted. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Democrats have attempted to rewrite the National Labor Relations Act so that it works as once upon a time in its first decade. It did work to empower workers. They tried that in 1960. Every time the Democrats have had a congressional majority and a president in the White House. 1965, it lost. 1979, it lost. 1993, it didn't go anywhere. 2010, it didn't go anywhere. And in this last session, it passed the House. It always passes the House when the Democrats control the House. But it couldn't, amass a filibuster-proof supermajority in the Senate. And two Democratic senators, and you know who, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, were unwilling to overturn the filibuster rule, and so it died there. Now, and it's now conceivable, which it wasn't a few months ago, if the Democrats hold the House, and if the Democrats actually pick up seats in the Senate, and that I would argue is likely because the Republicans have nominated some real Lulus in hotly contested Senate races, and I think the Democrats are going to gain in the Senate. But they only have a 5-seat majority right now in the House, and they have to hold that. But if they hold their majority, which is possible, it's a good long shot bet if you want to get odds, and expand their majority in the Senate so they can get a majority of 51, including the vice president, even when Sinema and Manchin vote no to get rid of the filibuster, then the PRO Act could really have a significant effect on unionization, because right now, as I said, there is greater public support for unions than there has been in over half a century, and the law is still dysfunctional, even despite the efforts of this very good people at the NLRB to bring it back to what it once was. And I should add the other caveat, which is that the courts are at this point disproportionately controlled by union-hating Republicans, of whom Samuel Alito, the author of the revocation of Roe v. Wade, is also the leader in that. There are so many signs of union rebirth, of millennial and Gen Z enthusiasm for unions, that we're having a collision between where workers are at and the strictures of much diminished law that pretty much have allowed employers to run roughshod over unions' desire to over workers' desire to be in unions. I'll close with this. There have been a couple events recently, public events around the country, with 3 speakers. Bernie Sanders, together. They're on this is like an act at this point. Bernie Sanders, Sarah Nelson, who is the head of the flight attendants, which is a division of the CWA, communication workers, and who are endeavoring to unionize the flight attendants at Delta Airlines, and the new president of the Teamsters, Sean O'Brien. They recently addressed about 4,000 people in Boston, I think the weekend before last. And the presence of Sean O'Brien is very interesting in this. One does not associate the Teamster president going around with Bernie Sanders. This is a new phenomenon. And he is also looking at possibly having to have a strike next year at UPS, United Parcel Service. In many ways, the last great strike victory, aside from the teachers, was that of UPS way back in 1997, when they did a brilliant job of rallying community support behind them. This is our friendly UPS guy, or gal, as it were. O'Brien is trying to rebuild that and get public opinion as well as worker solidarity behind him. When the Teamsters are doing that, things can't be all bad. In fact, they're both hopeful as well as somewhat perilous. The November elections will have some real consequence, as elections usually do, for whether unions can actually really build on what is clearly worker sentiment and begin to consolidate that in growing power or not. So with that before us, I'll leave it there.
Well, fantastic, and thank you, Harold, for your comments and your hospitality on that fateful day in 2017. I think we can now turn it over to Betsy Ettore, who's going to be moderating our chat box. And I know we have a couple of questions that have already been put up there. So Betsy, who is up for our first question?
Cliff is actually, Daniel.
Awesome.
Okay. So Cliff, can you ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. Fast background to me, I'm the son of a teacher from the Detroit area. My life has been very much benefited by unions, UAW, Teachers Union in Michigan, probably in ways I don't know, which is why Kevin's comment about bias against unionization and the labor movement being baked in raised my eyebrows. Can you give some examples? I think I've been insulated from that. Oh, I should also say I work in Germany now, where we have a strong workers' council concept for all employers over a certain size. I would love to know what I'm being protected from and haven't had to experience yet. Thanks.
I think I was trying to talk about sort of institutional biases against the labor movement in like the American state, right? And the American economy. And I guess I would just put it to keep it short and sweet. The fact is that capitalists have more power than workers because they control the economic resources and they have the power to direct investment. But on top of that, there's fewer of them and they have much more coherent interests than workers. So workers, why is it hard to organize workers? Well, they actually have a lot of economic interests in common, but they have a lot of other disparate interests and they all come from different backgrounds. And the hard work of an organizer is to fuse all that into some kind of unified force. Capitalists have a much easier time uniting because their interests align much more easily, right? They want cheap labor. They want certain flows of immigration that match what they need for the labor market, no more, no less. They want taxes low. They have coherent interests in a way that workers don't. And that translates into kind of a structural advantage when it comes to confronting workers organizing, right? You also have more access to politicians, and so the laws get written based around what the wealthy want. And so I guess I just mean in those ways, you're always going to have more power. Capital is always going to have more power than labor to some extent, and that's what I meant by those structural biases in the system.
And the disproportionate power of capitalists also gives them disproportionate power over law and how it's administered. And in the National Labor Relations Act, as it's existed now for the past 40, 50 years, when an employer violates the act by doing something which the act forbids, firing union organizers and such as that, up until this latest iteration of the NLRB, all the employer is required to do after this goes through the courts and the organizing drive is crushed, and years later or months later, the employer is only required to post a notice in the workplace saying that this has been ruled an illegal labor practice, an unfair labor practice, and he's had to pay the employee he fired the wages that employee lost minus what that employee made on his new job. I mean, in other words, there's no effective deterrent to breaking a union campaign in the private sector under the National Labor Relations Act. As I said, the current NLRB is working very vigorously to try to change that. And things like that are among the things that could be changed legislatively with a PRO Act and actually an enhanced PRO Act, because the NLRB under Abruzzo has gone beyond what's in the PRO Act, but an enhanced PRO Act could also change that.
Okay, thank you so much. Eric Marcus, I think you were in the queue also.
Yes, so thank you. Roberto answered my question about the growth or any changes in the population of temporary workers, which is very interesting. But my other question is for Harold, or comment really. You made a very good point about the community support for the UPS strike, and to me that in a very real fashion, in a very real sense, is one of the most important aspects that any strike can, or any group of workers can have in support. Bringing it home to the people that are the end users of their services, how they are important and why they are, not necessarily to justify themselves, but why they're worthy of people paying attention to them.
Well, let me say something so that Kevin doesn't have to toot the Chicago teacher's own horn, which is that one of the things that the Chicago teachers first did, and even in this early strike that Kevin was talking about, was making sure that their demands, which were included really community demands, including opposition to closing 50 schools, which is what the Rahm Emanuel Chicago mayor and his minions were proposing. And a sort of doctrine, as it were, has arisen around the notion called BCG, bargaining for the community good, which teacher unions have been doing by even, at the inception of their negotiations with management, bringing community members in, talking about community demands, about more social services, better parks, things like that. And unionists like Sean O'Brien at the Teamsters understand that they need to do this. There were some strikes, or some remarkable strikes among bakery workers, an old union that I know my friend Penny had a good deal of contact with back in the day, against Kellogg's and other facilities. And there were some towns in which, some cities, I think, was it Wichita, Kansas City? I'm trying to remember, where, the Kellogg's bakery was like a major employer. And again, they didn't go out until they had all this church and community group support. So this is kind of becoming a new, a more conscious strategy. I mean, it should always have been a strategy, but a more conscious strategy. There was a union president, I think the president of Kevin's International, who once told me, community is the new density, meaning even if with the declining share of unionized members in any given occupation, you need to have community support if you're really going to make any difference.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Bruce will be asking a question, but just before Bruce does, just to say to the folks who are the speakers, perhaps doesn't look like we have too many questions, and if not, maybe you could also respond to each other's comments. But first, let's have Bruce to speak and ask your question, Bruce. Thanks.
Thank you, Betsy, and really, really big thanks to Kevin and Roberto and Harold. I have this sense that we're kind of sitting around a huge table talking about what we know and what might be best practices and how we can move ahead together to the general election, in the midterms, and beyond 2023, 2024. And I would like to ask Kevin, Roberto, and Harold to respond to some of what I'm going to say briefly right now. First of all, Kevin, it seems as though in addition to the nurses and those Amazon and Starbucks workers, heck, the teachers are really, really showing us the way right now. And I'd like to know what we can do as progressives abroad, also collaborating with progressive all over the United States to help the teachers take best practices to the next level as we try to do what Harold suggested, hold the House, add a couple seats in the Senate, and really get in a good position for 2023. And if you have anything to say about what's going on in Minnesota right now, I'd like to hear that too. Then Roberto, what you're saying about the link between labor organization and what I want to call climate and environmental justice with that great CJA work, it seems like you are really in the thick of and probably leading up to 2021 and now implementing in 2022. If you could tell us a little bit more about how that's going in Illinois and how workers are maybe organizing and getting pumped up about what we can do to kind of fight climate change. I'd like to hear more about that. And Harold, I'd like to ask you, what you said about holding the House and it being a long shot, but proDA is really now dedicated to going all in on that. And do you have any tips for what we can do now leading into September and October so that maybe we come out in a good place for 2023 with holding the House? Kevin, could you take it away starting?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. I will say one thing is that the bargaining for a common good is the framework that's being used by most of these progressive teachers unions now. We don't have bargaining for the common good in New York. The UFT is not run by a radical new leadership. It's run by a fairly traditional leadership that works pretty closely with the sort of established city government. And our current demand for our social justice caucus in the union is to fight for open negotiations, kind of on the model that Harold laid out, making sure that not only the community, but even the union's own membership is involved. And I think the thing that's happening in the teachers unions that explains why there's so much dynamism there, I mean, it's partly that there's been such an acute attack on teachers unions, which has sadly at times been bipartisan. I mean, Rahm Emanuel in Chicago was a member of the Obama White House for a while. And so feeling like we have very few friends, we've had to dig in and develop our own internal democracy. And so it's not just that teachers unions are more aggressive in confronting the employer. It's not just that they are trying to reach out to the community. Both of those are true, but all of that is being powered, like the piston driving that is democracy and a fight for democracy inside the teachers unions. And I think when we're talking about a period of labor renewal, that looks like two different processes that kind of happen separately, but that are all part of the same thing, in my opinion. And that's one, new organizing. And so we talked about how the Starbucks Workers United, it gets support from other unions, but it's not really directly under their umbrella. And it's very much fueled by the workers themselves. The other thing that happens in a period of union renewal is traditional unions have internal fights for democracy. Sean O'Brien is an excellent example. I think it's worth reflecting on how much power Sean O'Brien and the Teamsters have. I mean, I think there's something like 1.1 million Teamsters, and all of those people have families and children. It's an enormous number of Americans who are under Teamster benefits and Teamster pensions. And I think they reach outside of what are maybe like the traditional, because it's a national union, because it's a very working class job, because it doesn't require a college degree. It includes a lot of people who are maybe not as securely in the Democratic tent as we would like them to be, right? And so I just think the tremendous power of the Teamsters. But Sean O'Brien and his new leadership is partly the result of Teamsters for a Democratic Union, which is an organization that's been around for decades and has been doing very difficult work completely outside of the vision of the wider progressive left, slowly burrowing away in this behemoth of a union to make it more democratic. And now the new militancy you see in that union, it's a result of that struggle for democracy. Sean O'Brien spoke at Labor Notes. Labor Notes is an organization that has always put union democracy at the center. And having him there speaking to the 4,000 attendees at that conference with Chris Smalls from the Amazon Labor Union and with Stacey Davis Gates from CTU. I mean, you really saw that this new fight for democracy is where like the beating heart of this new labor movement is. And that means it's not just a fight for union democracy, it's also a fight for workplace democracy. And then that means it's also a fight for democracy writ large in America. So what I would say, the reason the teachers are at the forefront is because for 12 years now, we've been struggling to make our unions more democratic.
Just, you know, to build off Kevin's points, I mean, what's exciting about the moment right now, it really is, I mean, workers don't see themselves as separate from unions. The workers are the unions. It's people on the shop floor relating to one another. Like when you're talking about the Starbucks campaigns, people are talking shop to shop and helping, you know, it's not driven by staff, it's workers who are helping each other learn how to organize and giving people the skills to do this work. And we're seeing it, you know, really make history. So it's really an exciting time. And most of my experience has been in warehouse organizing, and you know, the pandemic was devastating. And when we talk about Chris Smalls, we got to remember back that, you know, part of how we started this whole journey was being in a workplace where people were getting infected and dying and where it wasn't safe, right? And I think it's really important to remember that. And also that, you know, Kevin touched on this as well, is that, you know, not only do we need to make it easier for workers to organize, we need to hold the Biden administration accountable to make it easier for workers organizing. You know, that's a really important step. And that's why this next election and the election thereafter are going to be really important, because we are finding ourselves with more space to do this work. These staffing agencies create a lot of barriers. They're these contrived things that make it almost impossible to organize warehouses. You know, we need some good joint employer rules, and we need to be able to maintain those in order for warehouse workers and people in manufacturing to be able to actually organize and win at these workplaces. But I also think we need to acknowledge, you know, we need more of a strong welfare state. And there was a huge government intervention that got us through the COVID downturn, and that did help millions of workers' lives. We need to maintain these kinds of things to give workers the leverage at work, that like I might not necessarily lose my housing, or I might continue to have health care. And this gives workers, especially ones who are in the lowest you know, and hardest to organize industries like warehousing, the ability to take some chances and stand up to their boss and be able to win. You know, so I think the real push for a strong public sector that like really emphasizes green jobs and environmentalism is important, because we partially got through this because of some intervention by the government during the COVID downturn. And climate change is going to be worse than COVID. Like, what happens when California runs out of water? What happens when there's huge climate disasters? This is going to affect our economy, and it's going to affect our workforce. So I think that the labor movement needs to be a part of shaping what the public sector is going to look like, as it inevitably has to respond to climate change. And we need a strong welfare state and a strong public sector, coupled with strong protections for workers to organize to make their jobs better. But there's contradictions, especially with the labor movement and environmental movement. Bruce, you mentioned the Clean Jobs Act here in Illinois. We had environmentalists who were saying we don't need prevailing wage as part of this bill that's going to be passed. And on the flip side of that, when the Build Back Better was being entertained by Congress, trade unions in different parts of the labor movement were happy enough to get their infrastructure bill and throw the rest of us under the bus when it came to passing legislation. And, so there's real tensions in dichotomy around, building for a strong labor movement and an environmental movement. And sometimes we're at odds. But I would argue is that we really need to figure out how to come together, because it's one of the elephants in the room, and it's going to cause climate refugees that are going to be a part of our workforce. We need to make sure that they have the ability to organize. It's going to cause economic disruptions, which we need a strong public sector and welfare state to be able to mitigate. And the labor movement needs to be a part of shaping what the green economy looks like. Rivian, that's the big truck maker here in Illinois. They just got fined by the Attorney General's office for wage theft of Mexican nationals who work for third-party logistics companies at the manufacturing site, right? So we understand that the green economy is not necessarily going to be good for labor unless we organize and make sure that it is. So, these are exciting times, but, it's full of opportunities and challenges.
I'm a
So,
good deal,
Harold,
yeah, I'm a good deal older than Roberto and Kevin, so this makes me an authority on their generation, right? I would say so much of what we're seeing in the current upsurge is a generational upsurge, a post-2008 generation that didn't get the jobs they might have gotten had, all the financial house of cards collapsed in 2008, and had the subsequent recovery actually address them as opposed to addressing bailing out the banks. It took forever for the economy to get back to where it was before then. And it's not a surprise when you think of it that the generation that flocked to Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, and I don't think there's ever been, I wrote a lot about this, I don't think there's ever been a presidential campaign where, if you looked at the primaries between Bernie and Hillary Clinton in 2016, it was a function of age. The younger the cohort, the more pro-Bernie; the older the cohort, the more pro-Hillary. And I cite that because when we are seeing this huge level of support, and 77% is huge, for unions among young people, except for their teachers, if you look at the figures, most young people really have had no contact with unions. The rate of unionization in the private sector is barely over 6%. And there are 30 plus states in the United States where, you have to work really hard to find a unionized workplace. So what they're reacting to is, I think, what the 1930s generation, now we are talking something that's even older than I am, the 1930s generation was reacting to, which is just a sort of bred in the bone sense that the economy, the way it's structured, isn't working for them, for us. And you get generational politics. And right now, generational politics is decidedly pro-union. Now, as to the question of what, the upcoming elections, the real game changer was the revocation by the court of Roe v. Wade. And that's clearly led to a huge surge in women registering to vote, leading the Democrats to win or do better in special elections than anyone, including their own campaigns, predicted. I don't have like a crib sheet to cite specific races, but I think, Democrats abroad has the contacts to, get some word about which campaigns are worth trying to help out, however you can do it from wherever you may be. And the list of campaigns that are winnable has, in the wake of last week's special elections in New York, that list has gotten a lot bigger. So if you guys hear from various sources that there's a multiplicity of races where you might be able to help out, however you can do it. And if that list gets longer, well, so much the better. Betsy, your mic isn't on.
Okay, thanks very much, Harold, Roberto, and Kevin, for your great answers. We do have some 4 people for questions. We can go on until 20 past, and then Sue and Bruce would like to say a few things. Andrew, you had a question. You're on mute too. You have to unmute. Unmute, Andrew. Oops.
Okay, can you hear me?
Great. Yep.
Thanks, everyone, for your patience. I'll try to be quick, but a 75-and-a-half-year-old man with 30 years experience, I may have to be a little bit long, but I just want to say this. When I saw news of this, I'm living in Norway, where I've been for 8 years. And Harold, I began my career as a young board agent with the National Labor Relations Board in Los Angeles. Spent 5 years there and was recruited into the airline industry, where I didn't know much better, but the Railway Labor Act was a different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
And I thought workers were highly protected until I went through the first leverage buyout. And then I came to know people like Carl Icahn. And I wonder, has anyone heard of Trump Shuttle? Donald Trump, way back then, was playing his games and people were just beginning to learn. And I watched up close and personal as workers are being destroyed by very fancy lawyers who knew how to go into bankruptcy court, take their pensions away, take their health care away. Then I was asked to become a federal mediator under the National Mediation Board, just dealing with railroads and airlines. In fact, I dealt with UPS. And I was stunned at how it just continued to be. And here I was with a management background, stunned at how badly the balance was skewed against workers. By the way, Jennifer Rubin is my favorite columnist, and she's a former management labor lawyer. That should tell you something. She now is, we are deeply concerned. And then I went back to the National Labor Relations Board, where I ended my career, and I was shocked at how easy it is for these corporations, and I use the term advisedly, to crush workers. And yes, it's wonderful that we have a new general counsel, but ladies and gentlemen, the fight is just beginning. Kevin, I want to come to you because I also lived the teacher experience, and I'm definitely going to have some wonderful words for you, Roberto, but the federal courts are going to be a nightmare.
Right.
If you think they can delay and pay these penalties, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Most unions will tell you that the National Labor Relations Board spends more of its time and energy stopping union activity than it ever does protecting workers. The National Labor Relations Board must by law go into federal court within 72 hours to stop a strike. We've done that in Los Angeles repeatedly. But if an employer is crushing workers, it takes almost an act of Congress to get the general counsel authority to do that. Now, Kevin, I just want to say quickly to you, I became a teacher late in life. And remarkably, in a state like Indiana, I happened to be living through one of the boutique charter school operations. And I tried to tell my colleagues, hey, you know, this union thing's pretty important. And it was like, oh no, you know, we don't need that. We're independent people. We're based on, and I watched our school literally have union teachers replaced. I'm talking 30, 40% within the first 3 or 4 months once the administration got rolling on this. Now I'm in Norway. Everyone is organized. I say to myself, I don't believe this. Workers are respected. People know how to have holidays. They can plan vacations in advance. This goes back to my point is this. I want to thank you desperately. And Roberto, the key thing, everyone should reflect on those awful statistics you mentioned and how cleverly the use of temporary workers has become the way, among others, to get around union power. And I tell everybody over here, it's a contagious disease. What you see in the States is over here in Norway right now. This is a worldwide phenomenon. I think Kevin said it. Management, the money people have only a few and they can control things. I want to make myself available as a resource. I haven't touched this stuff in 20 years other than to read and be concerned, but I am so happy that the Democrats are finally waking up. Finally, I was a phone banker in 2018 in Red, Indiana. People forget that Obama won Indiana in 2008. I was in a steelworkers hall calling all Democrats and had people slamming the phone. What has happened to the Democratic Party that we've so lost touch with workers? When we call people non-college educated, when my father was called a craftsman, we need to think how we address, because if we can't bring them back in the fold, we're going to be losing our, not just our Democratic Party, we're going to be losing our democracy, because the key bedrock of protecting against authoritarians has always been strong labor movements, and not just protected by law, but as Kevin said, worker clout, worker organization, worker ability to stand together. So thank you all so much. Just let me know if I can help and I'll get out of the way. And finally, if you want to answer the question, what do you want to do? Get on the phone. Somebody said to me, I'm a phone banker extraordinaire. People say, why are you doing all this? I'm terrified. If we don't take back the Senate, if we can't hold the House, I don't know that we're going to get a 2024. So I'll let it go at that. Make calls, support the people you can, and stick together. You can contact me anytime. Happy to buy you a beverage if you ever get here. End of speech. Thank you all so much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. We only have about 3 more minutes. So
I'm sorry
Katie,
for
you're
that.
next. No, you don't have to apologize.
I
Katie,
am so happy to follow Andy Stites and everything that he said. And Andy, I'm just real happy that you asked for people to use you as a resource, because that's exactly what my comment is. Andy Stites is a top 10 phone banker in Democrats Abroad, making thousands of calls over the last couple of years. He absolutely knows how to do this and knows why we do it. So the question was asked a little while ago, what can we do? What should we do? Democrats Abroad has identified the 8 states where we need senators to win if we're not going to lose control of the Senate. And we are working really hard to get out the overseas voters in those states. We've identified 18 congressional districts. We are calling them. When there are members, that's the most effective way to get them to the polls. Absolutely, we have tracked it. 40% of the people we talk to go to vote from abroad. About 15% of the people we don't talk to, who are our members, go to vote from abroad. So absolutely, let's get the lowest hanging fruit and make sure that they turn out in numbers that will win close elections. There's a number of GOTV things that everyone on this call, if you're not doing already, please do it. Please make 5 phone calls a day. You'll talk to at least 1 or 2 voters. You will get them to the polls. Please help on intercom. Please put vote from abroad on your signature for emails. Please put it on social media. There's a list of 10 things that I sent to Sue and Bruce. I'm just naming some of them. I know I didn't get to all 10, but we've got 10 weeks to go. The overseas vote can win critical elections. Let's make sure that we focus our energy there. I know that there are important things to do in the US. Hope people are doing them. Trust people are doing them. Some of them are on this call. Nobody is getting to our voters but us. Thank you very much. Thanks you, Andy
Katie.
Stites.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, Ed, you had the last question. Can we make it short? Where are you,
I'll be
Ed?
quick. I'll be quick.
Great.
Okay, this is Ed Ungar from Toronto. Very taken with the news that the Teamsters are taking community support as crucial and working on it. My question is, both for the labor movement and the Democratic Party, would the slogan, "Every American deserves economic dignity," be useful? And if somebody thinks it might, can I be on the other side of the glass when it's focus tested? Okay.
Can I just say that Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown has been saying something rather close to that for a
Oh,
very long time. And Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown is the only Democrat who's been elected statewide in Ohio for the last 2 decades. So I think there's something to what you just said, Ed.
great. I can come down from Toronto to be on the other side of the glass anytime.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other final comments from Roberto or Kevin or Harold?
I'll just say quickly on the staffing agency issue. The United States is one of the only industrialized countries in the world that doesn't have any regulation around that. There's only 4 states in the country that regulate staffing agencies. New Jersey will hopefully become the 5th one this year. This is, it's not just driving down labor standards, but like people like Walmart and Home Depot and like Amazon does do more direct hiring, but if you go to their delivery drivers, that's all contracted out and crazy. And it's not just avoiding labor standards. It's to make sure that workers can't get organized and have power over these supply chains, because workers could have a tremendous amount of power in places where the biggest corporations in the world generate profits. So taking this issue on and like really regulating and creating policies that reel these work structures in is going to be important.
Thanks, Roberto. Just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody tonight for speaking and asking questions. And now I'm going to turn over to Bruce and Sue to give us some feedback.
Bruce, are you muted?
Why, yes, I was. I want to thank all of our speakers so much. We are all about getting out the vote, and we also are all about talking about why we vote, why it's so important. And I think the last 90 minutes have demonstrated again that there is a big reason to vote. And if we get the job done, we're going to be in a good place to do some of the things that didn't get done in 21. And that includes passing the PRO Act. So I wrote in the chat that I made 25 calls yesterday. It's time to phone bank, everybody. And I also want to say that proDA has been doing pretty good in the fundraising category, and that money that we're donating is being used for phone banking. So it only makes sense that if we're going to donate, we have to loop back around and make some calls. And I'll tell you, yesterday I was talking to people in Israel and Greece and Spain, and some of them wanted to know, why are we doing this? And it's meetings like this that give us some talking points. Now, moving forward, by the way, this slide is going to go as a link into the chat. So almost everything you see here is linked to more information. It's all there on the slide that you can open in the chat box link. On the 30th of August, we're going to have our next Reparation Task Force meeting. It's at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And our very excellent team that is uniting with over 350 organizations in the United States wants to get across the goal line with that HR 40, which has more than enough votes in the House to pass. We just have to get the House leaders bring it up for a vote so that we can then continue the fight in the Senate. Join RTF on Thursday at 1 p.m., or excuse me, not on Thursday, tomorrow on Tuesday at 1 p.m. to learn more about their excellent work. Then on September 1st, that is Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, our DA, DNC members will be holding a town hall in advance of the summer DNC meeting, which will be taking place in Maryland from the 8th to the 10th. There are some really important resolutions to be discussed, including one that Katie is working on about restricting the first use of nuclear weapons. There are also other resolutions, including some about dark money and politics. And we, proDA, will be presenting briefly the DNC members for Party Modernization, a group of collaborative incubators who are looking at ways to make the Democratic Party more effective, better outcomes, and echoing what Andrew Stites said too, making sure that we have our eye on the prize concerning labor organization and the link between labor and progressive politics. Then on September 3rd, we'll have our next Progress for Progressives meeting. That will be at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. And there will be fine-tuning our work going into September and October. You know, a lot of states are going to be sending out those ballots on September 24th. That means we have some crucial weeks now to mobilize more and more of our voters and get them ready to take their ballots, fill them out, and submit them by the end of September so that they get to where they need to go on time and all our votes are counted in the general election. Some of us have been talking about the DA state teams and trying to figure out who the candidates are. And I'm telling you, the state teams have upcoming events. They're rolling through the month of September now. There'll be one for the Arizona state team, Texas state team, and take a look at those events, attend and figure out which candidates are going to represent us best going into the midterms. Finally, proDA is working on its own Meet the Candidates event for September 24th. And please save that date. It's likely going to be a meeting on a Saturday. And that is the day when a lot of us will be getting our ballots. And it will be friendly for the Americas, the EMEA regions, and Asia and the Pacific. Stay tuned for more specific information about our progressive bent on that Meet the Candidates event. It's going to be an event to remember. Stay tuned. Thank you all again for spending these 90 minutes with us. Betsy, back to you.
Okay, it looks like quickly, Katie, you had a question there? Or you had a comment? Katie Solon?
No, but I
see
would
it.
throw out, Bruce, that do you know that the state teams are running a 2.5, 3-hour candidate marathon on September 24th, which is ballot drop day?
That's okay. Yep. Wasn't on the global calendar when we checked it. Okay. Thanks, Katie. Appreciate that.
Well, we're inviting some really high profile people and it's a global thing. So you might want to coordinate with them on that one.
Yeah. Thanks for the heads up. Appreciate it.
And then I also put the Arizona event in the box if you want to know how and why to vote down ballot. Arizona can tell you that because it's all on the ballot in Arizona. We can flip the state legislature. We got some of those candidates coming and some other state and county candidates. It's Wednesday, the 31st at 7 p.m. and the link is in the chat, up a couple messages. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. I want to thank Daniel also for moderating with me, and thank you all, and have a good evening. It's an evening here, actually. Take care.
I think we can end the recording and maybe keep the meeting running for